Welcome everyone to another episode of the Lofthouse Group Podcast, where we speak to interesting people and leaders within the UK architecture and interior design sector. I'm your host, Ryan Gorman, Director of Lofthouse Group, and today we've got a really interesting episode. We're going to be covering all sorts of stuff, but specifically why Birmingham is set to be the next kind of London outside of London from an architectural perspective. And to talk through all of that with us on the show today, we've got Tomasz Romaniewicz from Bond Bryan, who runs the Birmingham office for them. He's growing that out now. So Tomasz, welcome to the show and thanks for coming on.
Good morning, Ryan. It's a pleasure to be here.
Nice. It's a pleasure for me because it's, I can say I'm interviewing a fellow Yorkshireman, and having been down in London, people who hear me now think that I've gone posh and my accent's gone. So anyone who's watching this, who watches my other episodes, if my accent suddenly becomes really, I'm going to try my best not to speak in completely ununderstandable Yorkshire dialect. But I'm afraid, I think for the rest of the day and probably for this session, I'm going to be speaking like I'm back home again. So apologies in advance to anyone who can't tell what I'm saying. But for the benefit of the audience, would you mind, Tomasz, just giving us a bit of an overview of Bond Bryan and what you do, and just to give some context?
Absolutely, yeah. So we're an AJ 100 practice of over 133 staff. Historically, we were based in Sheffield, where we've got the kind of headquarters of the office, but we kind of cover the full spine of the UK with offices in London, Westerham, and here in Birmingham. 133 staff, 6 directors, and kind of cover a wide remit of outputs, everything from architecture, landscape and urban design, digital services, interiors, visualization, and strategic work as well. Cover a wide breadth of sectors. Historically, the practice was centered around the education sector, whether that's FE, university buildings and schools, where we've got a huge track record. But most recently, over the last sort of 10 to 15 years, we've had a more kind of reasoned focus in the commercial sector, everything from advanced manufacturing, industrial, and then more recently, we've rapidly grown our living and residential sector, where it now accounts for over 50% of the business.
Wow, awesome. And am I right in thinking that you guys are quite passionate about having like a kind of different methodology about working?
Absolutely, yeah. And, historically, we've always been sort of kind of pioneers and sort of facilitators of projects, whether that's working with a wide range of stakeholders, whether that's university bodies, landowners, investors, local authorities, and almost, being very sort of proactive instead of kind of reactive in terms of how we generate projects within the office. So in many instances, instead of waiting for kind of clients to come to us, we're very proactive in how we do things, and like to be sort of pioneering and proactive as a means of sort of generating projects within the wider business.
Okay, and are you still focused on a particular sector, or are you cross-sector now, or is there a particular focus for the types of work that you're working on?
It's very much sort of balanced at the moment. Obviously, we've got a massive track record within the education sector. That will still always be a kind of core element of our income going forward. But it's been particularly interesting how we've adapted that kind of historic way of doing things, our kind of unique methodology, and sort of transferred it into things like the living sector, the residential sector, where, as I mentioned, it accounts for sort of 50% of our income now. But also, we cover a wider remit. We're very client focused, and particularly over the last sort of 5 to 10 years, we've actually restructured the business as a series of sub-brands. We believe the role of the architect is constantly changing, and it's very much becoming a much more kind of interdisciplinary profession, as opposed to, what an architect was doing sort of 15, 20 and sort of 50 years ago. So now, as a consequence of our 30th anniversary, over sort of 3-4 years ago, the business operates as a series of sub-brands, and we've actually dropped the name architect from our branding. So we're just known as Bond Bryan because we cover a wide remit of interdisciplinary outputs across the business.
Sorry, you talked me through that. So there's different sub-brands now. What does each one of these sub-brands deliver, and how does that kind of tie into the bigger Bond Bryan umbrella?
Well, at the core of it, we're an architect. We're an architect. We offer architectural services. Design is at the heart of everything that we do. We understand that kind of good design has a profoundly positive impact on the lives of people that we work with, and beyond our role. Similarly, over the recent years, schemes have become so landscape-led, particularly in the context of placemaking, and we often felt, particularly in a lot of the projects that we worked on, landscape, as key as it is for things like well-being and rapidly improving the quality of a scheme, that was often the first thing that would have an impact from a value engineering perspective. So we identified, what if we had landscape architects working within the business, working with our urban designers, working with our architects, within projects. And similarly, if we have that expertise within house, we can make that more viable for clients and overall, improve the kind of overall impact of a project at the later stages. Similarly, things like Bim and digital services are absolutely fundamental to what we do. We're one of the leading players from an architect's perspective within the use of Bim within the UK, and have been using Bim within our methodology for a good couple of decades. And it offers a kind of wide remit of kind of benefits to clients, whether that's, state-of-the-art Bim services that we use within our architectural services. But similarly, we also offer that service as an addition, as a kind of separate business under the name of Bond Bryan Digital, which is based on information management. And in many instances, because that's absolutely fundamental to, how projects are procured and delivered now, our digital team actually get appointed as information managers on projects where we're not the actual architect for. Oh, wow. So that's absolutely great as well. Then we have strategic, which I'm heavily involved in. And the strategic department originally grew out of a lot of the work that we were doing for further education colleges, universities, etc., where we often get appointed to do estate rationalization programs for clients. So this involvement and this early engagement within a project is, if I was to contextualize it in the REBA plan of work, for example, we'd be getting involved in projects at REBA stage -3 if there was such a thing. But what it allows us to do is to work closely with the client and fundamentally develop a brief for them and identify a series of outputs which have a kind of benefit cost ratio for them to almost go to their investors, their board of governors, if it's a university or a school building, for example, and sort of demonstrate the kind of best benefit cost ratios of a particular solution. So is it that on the buildings or the sites that they own, we build a new college building? Is it the most affordable solution, the most viable solution is actually a series of refurbishments and kind of upgrades and kind of rethinking the existing spaces and internal models that they've got? Or is it that we can actually rationalize their estate on 2 of the assets, what they own, and then in tandem we'll work with them and develop an outline planning consent and sell that site with an outline planning permission to use that as a kind of revenue stream or a capital receipt that they can reintroduce within the business, to kind of really bring their sort of services forward. So, that particularly the kind of strategic element is kind of fundamental to what we do. And it goes back to that kind of essence of us being very proactive in terms of us being a facilitator of projects for our clients, because this is absolutely at the core of what we do. And then similarly, we've actually transferred a lot of the strategic element into the work I do with what's known as Bond Bryan Living. So because of the rapidly increasing amount of residential work that we've got, we set up this sub-brand, which isn't just about us as architects working on residential projects. Historically, I've always, in terms of how the kind of housing industry and residential projects work, I've always found that there's a gap between the kind of missing middle of a developer acquiring a site, for example, and architect's appointment, and that's actually, it's actually quite a fundamental process within the process. So we've basically established Bond Bryan Living as an industry-leading solution for landowners, developers, contractors, local authorities, and investors to create viable, deliverable, and outstanding places to live, and that covers the whole spectrum of residential projects, whether it's the acquisition, sourcing sites, and generate a project. It's the design, us either creating a brilliant place to live, getting involved in terms of the kind of lifestyle and how that can impact on design, working with stakeholders and stakeholder engagement. And then on top of that, because we're absolutely big on delivery, we've got an industry leading delivery solution for high density projects. So it very much sort of covers the full spectrum in that sense, Ryan.
I was just going to say, it must be reassuring. I guess you can tell me, like, for a client to be able to know that they can get a full service all under one point of contact, one business.
Absolutely. I mean, we're of a size, and we've been around for 30 years. And when talking to people who are starting kind of new practices or architects who are in the kind of early stage of their sort of professional journey, I mean, one of the absolute sort of fundamentals is repeat business and repeat work. So across the sectors, we're absolutely sort of fascinated by that. And you can't be around for sort of 3-4 decades without that reliance on clients coming back to you. But in a rapidly changing industry, it's how do we add value throughout that process. So for example, we've been able to grow the residential work and our living brand as a consequence of some of the key relationships that we've got in the education sector, for example, because that was very much the kind of foundation of the practice. So for example, with a lot of the strategic work and the work we're doing with FE colleges and universities, where we're involved in their estate rationalisation programs, and one of the outcomes will be that we'll get an FE project out of it, or a university project. But with me working with our education team in that, it's given us off-market land opportunities that we've been able to bring developers to build the residential side of the business, whether it's for things like urban build to rent or strategic land projects. So it's that entrepreneurial spirit that I often find is kind of touched upon at university, but a lot of architects kind of come into practice and that kind of entrepreneurial spirit is often kind of forgotten about, because you get into the kind of the kind of restrictions of sort of everyday business. But look, Ryan, as we've always said, it's a rapidly changing industry, and we see ourselves at the forefront of that interest in industry, and always looking to kind of think outside the box and add more value to our clients.
Yeah, well, God, the industry hasn't changed anymore, I think, it hasn't changed as rapidly as it has over the COVID pandemic, or it was very much an event that has made the industry change a lot. I guess as a company that works cross-sector and offering a full range of services, I'd be really interested to hear what your view has been on which parts of the market or which sectors have quietened down, which ones are starting to have a comeback. Like how did you guys view it over the pandemic? Now we're starting to come out of the other side. Like, has the industry changed, and are there certain sectors that are picking up quicker than others in your view?
Absolutely. Yeah, it was really interesting. I mean, like a lot of people, because of the unknowns and the kind of abnormals around it and stuff, there was a lot of uncertainty. So we were nervous in the beginning, but particularly for sectors like build to rent, which has been absolutely massive for us during the pandemic. And we received a number of appointments through that period. We've just lodged an application for a major build to rent development in Sheffield for 336 units. And the confidence within BTR, for example, has been absolutely massive through the pandemic. And what's been really interesting as well, I don't think COVID's fundamentally changed anything. It's more accelerated themes and certain nuances what were perhaps already there. But what's been really interesting for something like BTR, we've seen a massive change in attitude from investors. So one of the kind of biggest wake-up calls for me working within the regions as opposed to London, for example, is the challenges around viability on projects, compared to other parts of the UK. However, what COVID has done, it's allowed what were previously thought of from investors and developers as almost negative aspects to a development or would affect the viability of a development. So, for example, balconies and shared amenity spaces and good quality public realm and landscaping, whereas in certain parts of the country, they're a given. They're a massive challenge in parts of the regions to get a project to sort of stack up because it's difficult, or was historically difficult, to sort of demonstrate how you add value through those. However, we've seen a massive change change in attitude with investors and developers on the impact of things like well-being, amenity, sort of shared amenity spaces. And it's allowed, I think, overall, as a team between sort of client, contractor, developer, and investor, to kind of rethink those aspects and really get to grips of utilizing those and then being seen as being able to add value to a development. With the other sectors, obviously, there's been a massive pause in things like sort of student resi, some of the university work that we were doing in terms of front end and kind of new opportunities. But particularly now there's a lot more kind of confidence as to where we're going with COVID. We've seen a renewed attitude from the universities and the further education colleges, and we're really optimistic with a lot of the strategic work that we're already ongoing with, that will convert into live projects in 2022. But when you come out of a bad situation, there's always opportunities. Like for me, the student residential, I don't think universities are going anywhere. A lot of the youngsters who are kind of 16, 17, 18 now, or maybe a little bit younger, they're going to be wanting to go to university, and student accommodation is always changing. And I think what we've learned from COVID and how we've incorporated certain principles into the BTR sector, I think things like student residential have a lot to learn from that sector and will do within that kind of next wave of opportunities. So above all, I think it's a really exciting time to be an architect and to be in our industry.
Well, I was going to ask, because this will lead on to our next topic of discussing Birmingham and why that is primed for kind of an architectural, I don't know, is it over the top to say an architectural revolution? But I'll be really interested, you as someone, and we'll come on to this, you working in London and working in the regions, like typically, I guess, historically and typically, how has architecture differed in the regions versus, so like London, for example?
Absolutely, massively. I mean, you'll be aware of this, Ryan, as a sort of fellow Yorkshire lad. I mean, a lot of the areas and regions that we grew up in, I've not seen any investment for decades. So, particularly when I was sort of graduating, I did my degree in the north, and then I moved to London to do my part one, and then I finished the rest of my education down there. The disparity between the kind of north and the south was unbelievable in terms of the level of investment coming into London for genuine reasons compared to parts of the UK and the wider regions. And then on top of that was pre-credit crunch in 2008. That completely intensified that process. I remember I look back to when I started my part one, people were making redundancies and things like that in London, but they always tended to be workabout, and the vast majority of people, I'd say, when I look back, kept work. But a lot of my sort of colleagues who I studied with in the north, who stayed in the north, were out of work for sort of 3 years. But what's happened, or what's happening within the UK as part of the kind of re-leveling up agenda, the intensification of development in certain regional cities. Manchester has certainly led the way in that. It's opened a new blueprint, and the whole idea for the regions now is being rethought, and there's some really exciting things happening. Some really exciting initiatives, both within the public sector, whether that's the towns funds, the future high street bids, which we've been involved in a number, but the renewed attitude from investors in seeing, positive value within the regions and stuff as well, and fully deserved as well. It is about time that a lot of these areas got the investment that they deserved.
And do you think going back to like when you went through university, I know the world's changed a bit now, but was that differing investment in the areas, did that influence like the best architects coming through university where they would then go and want to work as well?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. When I was 21 in 2007, the whole UK architecture industry was centralized to London. From my own perspective, I felt the best practices in the UK were there. The part 2 courses were the best, probably not within the UK, probably the best in Europe. I mean, the caliber of students they attracted, and the difference between where I did my degree to where I did my diploma in London was phenomenal in terms of the quality of students that those places attracted, and that goes back to kind of teaching and the people involved within the universities and stuff. It was a real melting pot, but we have seen a renewed attitude now, and I would be able to firmly say that when I speak to kind of young students and stuff like that, it's not all about London anymore. There's some phenomenal architects and some brilliant things happening, obviously in Birmingham where we are, but similarly in Manchester, and even sort of places like Glasgow, you could argue as well. So it's really, really positive for the UK above all.
And I think it's really interesting that you see a lot of these key practices in London that have always had a big foothold in London, wanting to now expand into the regions. Rather than regional practices trying to crack London. It's a lot of companies are trying to now get out of London, which probably says something about the investment and the quality of architecture that's going on outside of London. But I guess on that, so I wanted to come onto your background a bit before we then talk about Birmingham, because obviously as you're and tell me if I'm wrong, right, Yorkshire lad, moved to London to work. Spent some time there, worked in London, did the kind of typical London-based practices, progressed up, got your Part 3, and then moved into this role at Bond Bryan to run also doing a stint in property, and then moving back into practice to run this Birmingham office. Can you just talk me through kind of the whole mindset of, working in London, working London architecture, and then what inspired you, or what kind of... what the decision was that made you kind of pack up your life and move to Birmingham and head up this opportunity at Bond Bryan?
A number of reasons. I mean, sort of first and foremost, I wouldn't change anything that I got with those sort of London experience, both sort of studying and working. Work with some amazing people from an education perspective. I couldn't have changed anything, and I'm a big believer as well. I mean, you probably noticed a similar thing. I mean, London moves 3 times faster than the vast majority of the UK. So not just in a professional context, but in a personal context. The experiences I had and the people I met down there were absolutely phenomenal. I wouldn't change a thing. But it was around the time of qualifying that I began to get a level of sort of frustration around work-life balance, the number of hours I was working. And when you're young and you're working with people in a similar situation, it's all you really know. And I also realized as well, when I began to get to sort of Part 3 level and began to run projects, there was a massive disconnect between what I'd learned at university aligned to the realities of the industry that we work in. And, I was working on projects with private developers, and I was getting absolutely assassinated in meetings. I didn't know about net to grosses and that areas were a thing. Like, in university, it was just design. As good as that was, there was this massive disconnect between, one component and some absolute fundamentals as to how the architects exist in the industry that it is. So with that level of sort of frustration and, I've always been a sort of people sort of focused individual and stuff. I'm at a lot of events and things like that. And just by chance, really got the opportunity to move into development management for a couple of years, because, I had this fundamental realization that, the developer is absolutely core to the process. It's not really the architect anymore. The architect is part of a kind of wider development machine in that process. So where might the opportunities be within that respect? But being honest with you, Ryan, I mean, the 2 years I had in development management where I got an understanding of viability, land acquisition, this whole process that happens before an architect's appointment, which is critical to, whether a project goes ahead or not, and, whether you get a piece of architecture in the end of it, and seeing things differently from a client's perspective and their priorities, what were their concerns. And to be honest, I probably learned more within that 2-year period about architecture, or just as much that I'd learned about architecture within those 2 years as I'd done the kind of 9-10 years prior to that I was within the industry. And then, things were starting to get going within the north of England again. I'd always had this kind of burning desire within the back of my head is, what if I went back to Yorkshire, what would that look like from a kind of professional context? I mean, 2 years prior to that, I had no desire to come back. And then a lot of the national conferences I went to, where I'd speak to other sort of property professionals in sort of Leeds, Manchester, And they were all saying, yeah, it's becoming, the M62 corridor is becoming a really exciting place. All the other investors I was speaking to, things like build to rent, which had become starting to get really dominant within the London market, was really starting to get some momentum within the regions. And then on top of that, a number of personal things happened. I'm a big Huddersfield Town fan. We got into the Premier League. It was
that was the real reason that you wanted to move back up. Yeah.
Yes, so it was just a no-brainer, really. But I always said if I ever came back to Yorkshire, it had to be a career progression. It had to be a step up. Met with a number of architects, met with a number of developers within the Yorkshire region, and always knew about Bond Bryan. Always knew they had a really good reputation. Yeah. Was always really impressed with the work that we're doing and stuff. So it was a no-brainer that I kind of reached out to them. We had a number of conversations up in Yorkshire, and then they came down to London to see me. And it was just kind of put to me within the interview that, established practice, going places, but they really wanted to kind of build on the residential and the regeneration work that they were doing. It had only really been sort of 10 to 15% of the business. And after a couple of years being back in Yorkshire, I got offered the opportunity to kind of come down and take a lead role within the Birmingham studio. I mean, my role within the practice, I should add. It was very much a continuation of what I've been doing in development management. So it was, I act as a kind of like a halfway house between architecture and development. So I'm out there sourcing sites, I've got relationships with landowners and within the private sector. I'm building relationships with city regions and local authorities. And then I'm also doing a lot of the work, as I mentioned before, with our strategic guys in terms of FE and university, and looking at where we can add value through that process, as well as playing a kind of strategic role across the business in building the living brand. And then with the opportunity that's in Birmingham, it was just one of those what was just too good to turn down.
Yeah. I guess following on from that, I really want to talk about how Birmingham is becoming this new exciting place to come in and do architecture. I guess paint a picture for us, because I'm sure a lot of people probably have a preconceived idea of what architecture in Birmingham would look like, but what sounds interesting is the future of it. Because paint us a picture and tell us about the vision for Birmingham and why it's an interesting place for someone to come and practice.
I look really hard at kind of European history and European cities, particularly in the context of sort of politics, sort of social issues, and kind of architecture is sort of fundamental to that. And the way I see it, there's been a number of sort of fundamental chapters within sort of European history, if you like, where you get these kind of fundamental change and this kind of importation of ideas, culture, and an explosion of development, if you like. And you could put Athens there, you could put Renaissance Florence, 18th century Paris, Industrial Revolution Manchester, late 20th century Berlin, when the wall came down. They were kind of fundamental shifts in those aspects that I'm talking about. And I think Birmingham is definitely going to be the next one of those for a number of reasons. It epitomizes, in my view, the narrative that we're hearing within the UK about the re-levelling up agenda. Its strategic position within the UK, I think, is well placed or best placed to sort of benefit from that. There's some really interesting dynamics within the city, in the sense of it's the youngest city in Europe in terms of the most people under 25. It has a massive potential around brownfield land and the intensification of development around brownfield land. And this kind of, I really enjoy the relationship between the kind of public and the private sector that we have in the city. The mayor certainly has got a reputation for getting things done. In terms of intensifying a city and intensifying development, as we've seen in London, what's fundamental to that is getting the public transport infrastructure right. So they're really ambitious around that in terms of getting stations and transport connectivity into the right places. So above all, in my view, when you add all those kind of facets together, and the fact that more investment in a lot of areas is coming into Birmingham now and it's peaking over London, the caliber of companies coming into the city is just outstanding. Obviously, we had Goldman Sachs. They've just recently announced that they're going to open an office in Birmingham. And to add to that, Ryan, it was between Paris and Amsterdam and Birmingham. They chose Birmingham.
I mean, that does say that says something.
So yeah, that's a massive statement of intent.
Yeah.
HSBC, BT, and when you look at other blueprints of other cities and why they've been successful, and a lot of local authorities struggle with this. A lot of the local authorities I speak to around the country really kind of fail to understand this. Is that they're creating somewhere where businesses want to be. And what is fundamental to that is people coming into the city, it's jobs, it's wealth, it's that's going to fund new infrastructure, it's going to intensify development. And when you kind of balance that, without any shadow of a doubt, this is going to be the most exciting place to be an architect over the next 10 years.
Do you think the architecture, is it going to be, is the I suppose the need and desire to scale the city up quickly, is it going to compromise the quality of the architecture that's being built?
I think it's it's not, there's a balance of sort of views in that. I mean, the quality that I've seen recently, I'd say has been excellent. Comparing it to across the UK. I've got involved. I'm living in the Jewellery Quarter at the moment, which is a kind of southern quarter of the sort of city centre core. So I've got involved in the Jewellery Quarter neighbourhood forum at the moment, and that's the JQ is one of the most desirable pieces of real estate within the UK at the moment in terms of the calibre of developers coming in, whether it's Moda Living, Urban Splash are just up the road or just up the canal with their sort of Port Loot scheme. So it is attracting not only regional and national interest, it's attracting kind of international interest. There's a lot of awareness within the city about, things like the quality process through planning to improve the end product. So in the context of the JQNF, which I've got involved in, I'm involved with we're setting up a design review panel. They review planning applications and applications at kind of key milestones within projects to almost kind of protect that quality. And then there's things coming forward like a neighbourhood plan, which includes aspects of a design code for developers, for people coming into that region. Equally as well, there's a massive emphasis within the city because of the requirement for things like housing and accelerated development. How would you do that? So what is going to be at the core of that is going to be delivering these projects with advanced methods of construction and modern methods of construction and things like design for manufacture process, which can rapidly intensify housing products. And I've been really impressed with the conversations that I've had with West Midlands Combined Authority. So one of the frameworks that they've set up is, well, if an investor or developer, if they're involved in public land or a publicly owned asset, if you're doing it on one of those, you want access to those opportunities, it has to be delivered in MMC. And we're big fans of MMC within Bond Bryan. Just as a kind of whistle-top tour, it's a specialism that we've been involved in for decades because of a lot of the education work we've done in things like schools. We've essentially transferred that knowledge into the living sector, into the residential sector. And more recently, last year, we were awarded Offsite Architect of the Year in the Offsite Awards. We've got a number of exciting initiatives and projects within MMC and DFMA, working with the likes of Berkeley Homes in London, leading MMC developer Top Hat. We're on site with the Kitchener Barracks scheme, and we're a design partner for Inner Space Homes, who are one of the most exciting volumetric MMC developers within the UK at the moment. But in the context of the region, the local authority and the city region, I think that quality is really coming through, and you need that balance at the end of the day.
Yeah, is it a focus at the minute from what you're seeing in terms of the demand for projects and the demand of work that's coming through? Is it a particular sector that's I don't know, more demand than others at the minute right now? What types of projects are you seeing come through?
Without a doubt. Obviously residentially is the hot one because of the need for housing, the need for good quality of housing. But it's not just about meeting housing numbers. What's absolutely fundamental to the success of a city, and this goes back centuries, it's we need to diversify housing product and housing type. So it's not just about building houses for sale. It's about things like build to rent, both urban and suburban. Equally with BTR, even though that's exploding as a sector that has its own challenges as well in terms of, BTR in a lot of instances, Ryan, as you're probably well aware, it is a premium product. If a city is going to be successful, then, we need things like key worker housing and housing and, dense housing that, meets kind of planning need and all the rest of it. But it isn't just about living on the 49th floor of a building or, hipsters in the 20s, as important as that is, we need housing for all different kinds of people and a range of different products, high rise, low rise, medium rise, etc. So yes, obviously, so residential is massive, and we are seeing a renewed attitude towards workspace and office space, which I think is going to be really interesting because of the amount of companies looking to move to Birmingham. We don't have the office space to meet that need, and I think as we come out of COVID, Birmingham is probably in more of a pole position than, say, somewhere like Manchester or other regional cities to really define, well, what does the workspace look like sort of post-COVID? Because the market and the potential for Birmingham in respect of that sector in terms of commercial workspace and all the rest of it is so exciting here.
Yeah. Do you think that there is an interesting opportunity or a different opportunity for, say, London-based architects right now that are considering their options and maybe thinking about moving jobs to another practice in London? Is there a viable opportunity to come up to Birmingham and do something that's interesting or kind of comparable to what they would expect to work on in London?
Without a doubt, I'd say comparable, but equally as ambitious, and in many instances, kind of new territory for sort of, redefining, because Birmingham's still going through that journey. I mean, in terms of, what's interesting for me when you look around the city, you get really good, or more obvious than other cities, you get a really good example of where the city's come from. Where it's been and where it's going, and you can really sense that kind of tension and that kind of, to use an architect's phrase, which I try and avoid, but juxtaposition, sort of more so than kind of other cities. But because it's going through that journey, there's massive potential to sort of define, what does housing delivery look like in 21st century Britain? How can we redefine the role of public realm and sort of placemaking and things like that? Because the region and the level of investment and the scale of the opportunity is kind of absolutely profound compared to other cities and stuff. It's a really exciting region to be.
So I've been to Birmingham multiple times. I've got a lot of friends up there. I've never lived there. What's the cost of living like compared to London?
It's definitely cheaper than London. Obviously, those rates are going to go up. We're with the amount of influx into the city and housing demand, things like open market sale housing and stuff. Naturally, that's going to intensify because of the attraction that it's a region. But we're really interested in sort of finding that kind of missing middle. So a lot of the strategic work we do is, and particularly around sort of housing delivery, for example, I do a lot of work with city regions and local authorities on brownfield sites, what they own. And what we're doing now, we're working with specialist pension funds, London-based, who are specifically interested in, not your kind of high-end build-to-rent scheme and not your sort of typically affordable housing association type stuff, but that kind of missing middle, which is a really, really exciting market. So what we're essentially doing now, we're in discussions with West Midlands Combined Authority, as well as several local authorities and city regions across the country, where we're doing a lot of support on the assets that they own, and instead of them disposing of that asset, selling it on, nothing happens for 2 years. We're actually going to them you can actually make a revenue stream off the land that you own, and we'll work with you to develop a scheme for that site. We'll bring in the funding. We'll bring in the delivery partner, and we'll work in tandem with you to create a housing product on the site that you own that you can generate a revenue from. But not only will it do that, we can develop something that reflects the housing need for that particular area. So it's not reliant on what the market's doing. A lot of places struggle, and there is that kind of gap within Birmingham where there's prime real estate within the city centre, but you go to the Black Country, for example, and they need that development to happen, but all they're getting is things like permitted development and office to resi conversions, which it isn't about placemaking. It creates transient communities. It's usually for single individuals and stuff who aren't there for a long time and stuff. If we're going to solve the housing crisis and convince people to move to urban areas and get those kind of high density areas right, then we not only need to increase the numbers of housing that we're building, but we need to diversify not only housing product, but also diversify how we deliver and design houses. So we've really identified a kind of gap in the market where we're within this model. And again, it goes back to that kind of proactive approach, in the sense of, we're really interested in sort of challenging, what the architect does and how we operate. So it's not just about being a designer within those kind of 0 to 7 REBA stages. We bring in the funding, we do a lot of the support work around viability, we bring in the specific delivery partner, and we can build a package for delivering housing and generating projects.
Well, you've just come on to a topic that we've spoken about previously, which I'd be really interested for you to share your thoughts on, which is around how the industry's changing, and I guess how you see the architect's role changing to remain relevant as well.
You bang on when you say that. It's how do we remain relevant in, if you look at some of the fundamentals over the last couple of decades and beyond, compared to what an architect did in the post-war era, for example, when the most architects work for the public sector. That's obviously rapidly changed. The rise of the role of the project manager, design and build procurement, the role of the contractor now. So a lot of architects work for contractors in that kind of D&B structure. It's rapidly restructured what the architect does, and it's no surprise to see the constraints on things like salaries and fees and stuff, which are being constantly pushed down. But instead of seeing that as a restriction and as a negative, I've always thought, well, where are the opportunities within this new framework? Why don't we accept that, we're not this, the godlike approach to design has kind of run its course, where the architect did everything, and instead of moving away from that kind of individualism, seeing the whole process as a collaborative process, and where can we add value within that? And through doing so, that's how you can command things like fees and kind of better salaries and, better revenue, and make the role above all of the architect within that wider framework a lot more relevant.
No, that's really interesting. And I think that you've just touched on several of the most common complaints I hear from architects and business owners, about fees being dropped. It's becoming more and more difficult to work. So are you saying that it's actually, we need to be changing the way that we view the architect, and we need to offer a different service?
Yeah, without a doubt, and that that's at our core, and the reason that we act so interdisciplinary, whether it's a lot of strategic work that we're doing, because of my experience within development management, I have land opportunities that I can bring to clients, whether it's that's in the private sector or some of the other elements that we've kind of touched upon previously. That gives you a lot more control over the type of work and the type of clients that you can work with, and the kind of fees that you command and stuff. So, for example, if we do an introduction on a piece of land to a client, we can command finder's fees because we have that exclusivity over a site. We can charge more of a premium because we see the kind of greater value within that process. Similarly, as well, we're always thinking outside the box. Because we work in BIM, and we're design focused naturally, but we're also really big on delivery, and a lot of architects are scared of delivery, I find, and and where are the opportunities that come through that? And because over 50% of our clients are contractors, we've essentially restructured our sort of delivery methodology to align to a contractor's needs. So what do I mean by that? It means that we model everything from the outset. We can have more control over things like coordination and clash detection, and how architectural components work more holistically with servicing and structures. We can be more specific about net zero and low carbon targets. So And in many instances as well, we're actually finding that contractors are coming to us with schemes, with planning, and want to use us as a sort of executive delivery architect. So it's aligning your scope to reflect and add value in the industry that you're working in. And I just feel so many architects sort of fail to understand that. I always found it interesting when in university when the idea of being commercial or entrepreneurial as well as design focused and innovative was almost a taboo subject. But look at any other industry, Ryan. It's look at Apple. They are as commercially savvy, as cost focused as they are innovative and out of the box. And those two things go hand in hand. Whereas I do find a lot of architects are really kind of restrictive within that process and would be happy just doing beautiful things on street corners.
That's a really interesting way of viewing it, to be honest. It's I can resonate what you've just said very much marries with the things that people are telling me constantly about their frustrations with the profession. So I guess on that, what is, I know you've mentioned quite a few ideas, but what is the future of the profession? Are we there yet? Is there a lot of work to do? Do you think lots of companies are going to embrace this new way of working, or do you think why Bond Bryan are kind of are you guys like trailblazers in that way of working? Are there many other practices doing that?
We've always been sort of pioneers. Yeah, that there are a lot of practices doing interesting things, and I think above all, I am an architect. I am optimistic about the profession, but it's if you look at historically how the roles changed, going back to sort of Renaissance times, it's the ones who are successful and the practices what have been around for a long time. It's almost like every generation you have to kind of rethink how you do things, restructure your kind of working processes and stuff, because I often find that the moment that you think you know it all within this game, that's when it kind of bites you. That's when it has the kind of biggest impact, really. So it's always about kind of reinvigorating what we do, how we do it, how can we make it better, but completely aligning yourself to, the direction the industry is going in, whether it's Bim and Digital and sort of Bim level 2 and the kind of next bits of that, we're at the forefront of that. Equally, is it things like MMC and DFMA? Again, we're really kind of pioneering those elements forwards. And then also, looking at ways we can, add value to our kind of, our wider spectrum and sort of think about outside the box above all.
I'll ask you this. You might not have an answer for it, but since you bring up, you guys are doing a lot in BIM. Obviously, BIM and the improvements in software technology has improved efficiencies for architects and for kind of everyone in the industry, meaning that you probably need fewer kind of architect man hours per project. So, are there any other kind of technological advances that are coming up, or that you can foresee coming, that are going to kind of shake things up as much as BIM has done within the industry, or is going to really, how COVID has driven a lot of companies to have to make a change? Do you think there are any technological breakthroughs coming through, or technological advances coming through, that are going to suddenly be like, well, actually your job has to change now because you're not going to be able to work like that anymore?
Yeah, absolutely. DFMA is going to be key for me. I mean, that whole process is totally different to the sort of traditional REBA plan of work. And in a lot of instances, the architect's role is only needed up to REBA stage 2. And then after REBA stage 2, it becomes about liaising with modular providers, working with the factories, and then getting involved in that process as well. So it turns a lot of the kind of traditional sort of delivery process on its head. But again, instead of seeing that a negative, some people would say, oh, we only get appointed for 2 REBA stages. Where are the opportunities beyond that? Is it some sort of technical advisory role that sees architects having relationships with MMC modular providers and stuff, and they're in the factories a lot more and stuff like that, instead of going on site and arguing over the height of a damp proof membrane and things like that and stuff. I think DFMA and MMCs is only going to become more and more prevalent within the industry. Historically, whilst there's a lot of noise about it, very few kind of people are sort of progressing with it. And we've often found with projects, it's only really been viable in kind of London and the Southeast, but that's kind of massively changing now across all sectors. But I think it's going to be key to sort of turning on its head. Equally as well, the role of net zero, But the realignment of reusing buildings and repurposing buildings, and again, there's been a lot of challenges around that over the last sort of 10 to 15 years, whereas as an architect, you would always want to sort of restore, refurbish and reuse in the first instance. But there's always been viability challenges and stuff now. I think there's going to be immense opportunities around, repurposing existing buildings that completely exceed what we've been doing over the last sort of 20 odd years. So, what is the role of the architect in there again? But, for me, I am an optimist, and whilst, there's always going to be challenges, it's where are the opportunities to think outside the box.
That really interesting. Do you know what? We're kind of running out of time, unfortunately, because I think there's so much more we could talk about. Maybe we can have another episode dedicated to some of this stuff we're talking about. But I always like to finish up with a question, which is what important topics in architecture do you think we're not talking about right now, or what are the biggest challenges in architecture right now that we're not talking about enough, in your opinion?
Without any shadow of a doubt, Ryan, it's got to be education. Architectural education is a wonderful thing. We should protect it at all costs. But the issues I find at the moment, what concerns me the most is the disconnect between what is being taught at university and, the level that kind of part one students are at when they enter industry and where the wider industry is and stuff. There's some fundamental issues to kind of close that gap and kind of close that gap between industry and education. And, I don't know what the answer is in the outset, but I look at how oven ready a lot of the kind of junior technicians that we employ. So, they've done 3 years at university, similar to an architecture degree for part one students, but they can use BIM immediately. They're ready to go on projects. Whereas in a lot of instances, the part one students, and I went through a similar process myself, the first sort of year to 18 months, you're almost kind of unemployable. And I do see a lot of stats within wider industry about some practices not even employing part one students. And these are people who've paid through the roof, through the noses for their degrees. So above all, we need that connection between sort of industry and education. There's some really, there is some universities which are at the exception to that. I really get that, but a lot of the syllabus and a lot of the models that a lot of the architecture universities are employing is a massive concern for me.
Is there anything? Is this a problem that can be fixed quickly? And I don't know. Do you still see people come through that are able to provide value initially? Because I don't know. It must be a big issue.
The key for me is that, I do look at a lot of the universities and a lot of the work that comes out, when and I'm a big fan of working within the universities. I'm a huge fan of education, and I want to do where I can is add impact. But it's the lack of diversity within the architecture schools which is a concern for me. And I don't mean sort of there is obviously diversity in the truest sense, but diversity of the opinion, diversity of learning outcomes, and educational models that really incorporate a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about over the last over the session today. Whether it's MMC, whether it's DMFA, whether it's having kind of BIM ready students and stuff like that. Architecture will always be a discipline. I totally support that. I totally support the kind of theoretical elements that that are kind of needed to be at the core of the discipline. But that needs to go hand in hand with an understanding of planning policy and what the industry is doing. Because I just do fear at the end of the day, we're not going to be making graduates and individuals who are employable and are going to succeed.
Well, on that grim note. No, I'm joking. No, I think it's a really valid point. I think it's more and more architects I speak to are becoming disenfranchised by the whole education process. Do they earn enough for how much education they have to do? It's kind of a catch-22, right? Because you've got an architect who's coming, not a catch-22, but you can understand the frustration on both sides. You've got an architect that spent 3 years at university and spent a load of fees to come out expecting to be able to come out and work in a job, and find out that actually they hardly get paid anything if they can at all find a job. But then on the other side, you've got the practice who, are often being pushed down on fees, needing to have people working on projects that are productive, that paying people to be who aren't as productive as they could probably hope. So I can see why it would be a frustration on either side, that perhaps an education
Yeah.
reform might fix for both sides.
And it's that, entitlement is the wrong word, but, I do find there are a lot of students who maybe come out of university expecting to have a job, whereas that might always be the case. But I always put it down to, personal responsibility and individual responsibility is absolutely key as well. So you're gaining intelligence about what the wider industry is doing, gaining an understanding of, what's going out in the world, whether it's reading BD, reading AJ, reading other kind of industry journals. But yeah, it's going to be fundamental, and that's going to be my biggest concern over the next sort of 10 years is how we restructure education to align to the kind of fundamentals of being an architect in the 21st century.
Yeah. Well, look, Tomasz, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been really interesting to hear about how the architecture role's changed, all about Birmingham. Thank you for being on. Thank you to our listeners and our viewers for staying with us and watching this. If you are watching this on YouTube and you want to find out more about Bond Bryan or what Tomasz is doing in that Birmingham office, links are in the description. If you want to find out more about what Lofthouse Group do and how we might be able to help you, links in the description as well. But stay tuned. Subscribe to our YouTube channel if you want to watch more episodes. But until next time, thanks for stopping by.